Versant Ventures, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Versant, but they're a proud investor, obviously, in Turnstone and 6 other Canadian companies, a global fund with about $2.3 billion under management, and with a really big focus in the Canadian landscape in terms of biotech. So we have started specializing in company creation, really helping academics and early stage technologies to get off the ground and participate in the funding in the long term, all the way to an exit, hopefully. And we have a big focus in Canada, so this is a bit of a shameless recruiting pitch that we are here to invest in a lot of good companies, good science. And you have my contact information here if you have any questions around the landscape and so on and so forth. Please let me know. So what I thought I'd talk about today, really kind of leave at a high level. I was asked to talk about a bit like conceptually, you want to launch a business in life sciences, and obviously there's no turnkey solution. There's a million books about it. I don't think there's one that's really right. It's a bit of a mix of all of them combined with a lot of experience that usually makes it successful. But at a really high level, I'm going to walk through a few slides and really kind of highlight not so much how you do it, but the question you have to ask yourself to really know whether you can do it or not. And then we'll start about the concept of having an idea. And I think that's kind of the first false start with a lot of people is they have an idea and they think the idea is the business. Well, the idea is not the business. A lot of people have a lot of ideas. It's how do you think about your idea and what problem does it solve that creates it. Your business is the problem that you solve. It's not the idea you have. So we'll talk a little bit about that. It's a subtlety, but very, very important. We'll talk about the skill set you need. And the punchline is nobody has the full skill set, so you have to surround yourself with people that are really, really good skill set, and you have to learn to really work in teams and put the ego aside and really know what you don't know, which is probably one of the most important thing. And then I was about to talk a little bit about what's my idea worth, but in speaking with Jonathan, he's going to talk much more about the valuation stuff, so I'll maybe just quickly mention it and I'll move on and leave Jonathan, which I'm sure knows much more than I do about that stuff. Maybe just to take a step back, thanks for the intro. So for people who, so my role really at Northern Biologics, which is a Toronto-based immuno-oncology company funded by Versant, I wear 2 hats. So the role of entrepreneur in residence really means supporting Versant's portfolio companies in their operations. My first assignment is to be Chief Business Officer of Northern Biologics, and then also fundamentally is to start new companies. So once Northern is successful, then you go back to the fund and you work with the investment team to start new companies. So it's a really exciting thing. I've been on the job for 6 weeks. That's my other disclaimer. But I can tell you more about my background in the question period. But generally speaking, I don't know what happened here. There's supposed to be bubbles, but you get the point. Basically, holistically, to be able to, I think, to successfully at least maximize the chance, because I'm never going to say what the secret of success is, because I'd be sitting on a yacht if that would be the case. It's just try to maximize your chances of success, which is important, and then you do have to have a wide combination of things. I think scientific knowledge is obviously key in our space, life sciences, and not so much to be able to be smarter scientifically than the other person in the room. It's really to be able to talk the language. You want to be able to interact at scientific conferences, but it's okay to be, in business there's this famous 80-20 rule, right? You get 80% of the way with 20% of the effort. Always remember that. You don't need to be the expert. And I have a scientific background, which has expired a long time ago, but it's kind of hard to divorce yourself from this kind of training you had that you have to be the ultimate expert in everything you do. So have the ability to speak the language is very important. Obviously, the experience, there's really no secret. The experience is really about learning from your failures. Obviously, you learn about successes, but you learn much more about the failures. So that's one very important thing. Financial acumen is also very important. And again, that's as scientists, this is often when I talk about don't have all the entire skill set. It's really important to surround yourself with people that are very good at it, but also to educate yourself on it. You need to know just enough to ask the right questions. And then last but not least, which is I think the most important, is the network. I think Julia's story is great, how John's network and how Turnstone started is a perfect example of, without that network, I think it's fair to say that, that Turnstones might have been as successful as it is now, but it probably would have been a bit of a harder path. So when you put all of these together, it's really like, I think the formula, at least to maximize your chances of success. And again, if you really think about it at a high level, right? Like you say, okay, I have a great idea. Well, in my previous role, I was at a very large company called BioCanRx, which is a French company, and I was responsible for the management, the corporate venture arm of the company. And people, you come to us all the time, I have this great idea. I have a faster test. I have a cheaper test. And I was always like, in your mind, I was like, okay, so what? What problem are you solving, right? Your idea is not having a faster test, a cheaper test. Your idea is, well, with my faster test, then the physician can make this decision, which allow removal of antibiotics much faster, which saves money. That's basically your business. Your business is not the idea. So that's really important to sit down and think like, yes, I can solve a problem. Then you say, really, can you really solve a problem? And then if you can articulate the problem you're solving efficiently, I think you're really one step ahead of probably 90% of the stuff we used to see at BioCanRx. Another really important one that some people forget is, does anyone care about your problem, right? And actually, it's funny, but it's true. I mean, you tend to be working on something very specific. You're like, blood, sweat, and tears on it. But it's important to take a step back from a commercial perspective. Does anyone really care about what you're trying to do? And obviously, there's the social aspect of things, which is very commendable. But at the end of the day, if you want to be in biotech or in medical device, it's about making money. And then another very important thing, do you have the data? At least a part of the data that shows, again, Julia said that, you articulate your problem, but then you tease the audience with some promising data, and obviously you have more in the background. But you have to convince people with data, because the data will always, I like to say, the data will set you free. This is really your key to have people really putting credibility in you. And another obvious one is, is anyone else trying to solve the same problem as you are? And the answer, I'll give you a hint, the answer is always yes. Because if nobody's trying to solve the same problem as you, it's because your problem sucks. There's always trying to, and we'll talk a bit about competition and how to think about it. But if you're in a hot topic and a hot problem, you can guarantee that some people are trying to solve it as well. And then I'll skip a little bit of that part at the end, but because Jonathan's going to talk about it. But at the end of the day, how will the team, the company, and the investor are going to make money trying to solve this problem? Do you solve a problem? So a good example, and there's a lot of words on these slides, but I'm happy to send you. There's nothing confidential in there, so I can send you these slides afterwards. But the way I think about it is, in the life sciences, you have the biotech world and you got the diagnostic med device world. In the biotech world, do you solve a problem? Well, for instance, do you have a first-in-class solution? So something that nobody's ever worked on before from that angle. This mechanism of action is new. This is pretty obvious. It's a novel thing. There's also the concept of best-in-class versus first-in-class. There's something that exists today, but I want to make it better, less toxic, dosage more patient-friendly. That's interesting, but again, you have to think a little bit more about what the problem you're solving. So maybe it is more interesting, but at the end of the day, it's going to cost too much, so the hospital just won't pay for it, right? So you have to think beyond just the science of it. And the generics, right? Generics sometimes solve huge problems, but again, it's a much more, as you go down the commodity, you have to think more and more about the commercial strategy behind it. And the medical device, that's an interesting one. I'm giving maybe one example. Actually, two companies that I really like that we invested at BioCanRx. The bottom line is a Canadian company based in Richmond Hill. And then the top one here, Banyan Biomarker, is they had FDA approval for the first blood-based biomarker to diagnose the need of ruling out a CT scan for traumatic brain injury. So you bump your head, instead of having a CT scan, these two markers are released in your blood. But it's all about positioning, right? So let's take Banyan, for example. What problem are they solving? Oh, we can diagnose traumatic brain injury. That's not the problem. The problem is that you're able to give a tool to the physician that allows them to rule out the need for a CT scan. And by doing so, they save patients radiation, which is very important, and they save tremendous amount of cost because they don't have to run a CT scan. That's the problem you're solving, and that's how you can put a dollar amount around the problem you're solving, right? And I'll, just for the sake of time, I'll skip the Qvela, but it's also a great story. You can stop me with any questions also if you like. But and then your audience. I think, again, Juliette touched on a little bit of this, but it's really important to know your audience. And you cannot have one 20-slide deck that you basically shotgun everywhere like the spaghetti on the wall and pray that one investor is going to read his or her email and then reply to you. You really have to know your audience. You have to cater your pitch. And again, I'm referring to Julia again. It's absolutely true that you have to position your story the way the investor wants to hear it. It's going to make your life 100 times easier. And if you're lucky, you'll either get a champion within the investment, on the investment side, that's going to pitch the idea for you with its investment committee. So that's really where you want to be. Know your user. I was talking about the investor audience. You use your audience. Well, that's a little bit simpler. But you have to think about it a little bit. At Northern, for instance, in the immuno-oncology space, our user audience are the physician, the key opinion leaders, but also really importantly the pharma companies, and most importantly the pharma companies that have, for instance, a PD-1 program, because we've shown that there's tremendous synergies with the combination therapy, right? And then on the device side, it's a different twist, right? Another company that I really like is a company called Magnolia Medical. They do this device that virtually eliminates contamination for blood culture. So what are the audience? So when you pitch the hospital, well, you have the microbiologists, but also you have infection prevention. Oh, and by the way, you have the CFO of the hospital because that device costs much more money. But at the end of the day, you save a tremendous amount of money with avoided blood culture contamination. So you have to have all of these people as an audience. If you go in and you think it's just a microbiologist because it's a blood culture contamination story, you're basically dead on arrival. Your investor audience, we talked about it a little bit. There's different types of funding. I can talk to you guys about this offline. There's no problem. Grant money, again, very important. Grant money, not always easy to get. And then you have friends, family, angels, investors. There's actually big angel groups now, actually, that participate in later stage rounds. The VCs, and again, when you talk to venture capitalists, there's different kind of venture capitalists, right? There's the company creation, earlier stage, like a Versant, or Third Rock, or an Atlas, for instance, big funds in the US. And you have more the financial investors that come in, like a Fidelity, for instance. I think OrbiMed is interesting because they're usually more on the finance side, but they're starting to go more and more earlier stage. So again, know your audience. And yeah, so you can get some venture loans and all these good things that I'm certainly happy to talk to you about. Your acquirer audience. You never build a company to sell it. You build a company to really solve your problem. But you always have to keep in the back of my mind, you start developing your relationship with the folks that are going to acquire you in 10 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, the moment you start your company. So number one, because you get great feedback from folks who do that and they have multiple programs, and if you get a good champion within these companies, they can really guide you in helping you develop your product. But also at the end of the day, you want to sell your company or go public, but generate liquidity for your investors. So really know your audience. In the biotech side, again, if we separate biotech versus medical device, it's two different worlds. So in the biotech side, you start your company, you do a really good job at doing some really reliable, reproducible science. Toxicity, CMC is extremely important. It's one of the most important things you can do early stage. And then you go through your phase 1, maybe your phase 2, and then often there's a liquidity event. In the medical device space, it's a bit of a different spin. The risk on the medical device space is much more on the back end of commercialization. The science challenge is, I develop a new molecular test using PCR. PCR is PCR. There's some very clever ways you can play with your test and innovate on your test. But at the end of the day, you'll get to the market and you'll have a lot of competitors out there. So the risk is much around, yes, FDA approval, but I say reimbursement and market access. So how do you show post-approval that your test will generate a lot of money? So really two different pressure points here. How much time do we have? Do you know? 5 minutes. Ooh, okay. if you think I wasn't speaking fast before. Well, maybe I'll leave you just with the big kind of, not, I wouldn't say lesson because I have no lessons to give, but at least in my mind, the big take-home messages. You really have to build a tool belt. You have this great idea. You're sitting in your lab. As a scientist, often you never really want to talk about it to anyone about what you're doing because you're afraid people will steal your ideas, which happens. But if you surround yourself with people that know how to deal with these things properly, I think it's really important to really build your tool belt. In your toolkit, so to speak, you have to have your pitch, you have to have your technology, it has to be crisp, it has to be simple. And then it has to be if you talk about anything, make sure you don't talk about anything confidential. I cannot emphasize this enough. And confidentiality is not just intellectual property, it's trade secrets, right? So in doubt, just take a step back. And you know what? It's always a good, at least in my experience, a good sanity check with investors if you just give them enough so they're curious, and if they don't want to move on and sign confidentiality agreements, so on and so forth, they're just poking around, right? So you can use that as a strategic advantage. Obviously, you need cash, you need capital, and then you need to create a business plan. And guys, don't be lazy. Make a business plan. And business plans is not a bunch of slides. It's actually a document that you sit down and spend hours thinking about it, because you have your strategy. It's going to force you to think about your market, your competitors, and it's fascinating if you just sit down, because you always think you're too busy, but if you sit down and really take the time to craft a business plan, it really helps you think through some of these things. We talked about network. As a young scientist, PhD postdoc in a lab, it's okay that your network is limited. And it's tough to go and network. I always remember my first investor conference. I knew nobody. I feel like I was weird dating world with 1,000 strangers I didn't know. But just starts one step at a time. And talk to people. People love to talk about themselves. Ask questions and listen. And that's how you're going to kind of start building these relationships. We talked about business plan, very, very important. And again, educate yourself on the regulatory aspect of things. You don't need to be a regulatory expert, but just talk the talk, right? If you go pitch your ideas to friends, family, angel investors, VCs, it's okay to say you don't know, but just understand enough to ask the right follow-up questions. And I think that always scores a point, because nobody will ever expect that you know everything. Again, I cannot understate that enough. Data is your key, and keep it simple. I always call it the money slide. Like if you have a 20-page deck that you're presenting, and you decide to make an investment as an investor, there's always one slide that you remember. There's always this is the slide why we invested in your company, and it doesn't have to have a million different data points. It's what problem are you solving? Here's some preliminary data that I can talk to you about. And here's how huge this market is going to be if we can do it. And we'll talk about huge market. There's a certain level of expectations you need to set as well. Your credibility is very important. It comes with network and experience. And your IP obviously goes without saying. What? I'll negotiate too. How about that? No, I just have a couple of slides. You always have competitors. Always have competitors. And it could be different ways. It could be competing labs. And always remember, by the time a patent's published, it's been 18 months since it's been filed, right? So you're kind of if you learn about this by looking at a published patent, you're 18 months behind in your knowledge. So always think about that. You have other companies that are working on the same thing. And often the ones that surprise the most is the latter one here is technologies in other fields that can be applied to your field. AI in drug discovery, nanophotonics in optical spectroscopy. There's a lot of conversions of these fields, and I would encourage you not to be too myopic in the way you see competitors just by doing a PubMed search on the top 3 KOL that works on your protein, right? Just think a bit outside the box. Finally, my last slide is, it's a very important one. It's about thinking about your addressable market. And I won't go into a lot of details, but there is really the concept of total addressable market, serviceable addressable market, and serviceable, obtainable market. I had to cheat here because I didn't remember what it stands for. But the bottom line is, if you think really about the problem you're solving and you understand it well enough, you'll know that, yes, maybe there's for $10 billion worth of this type of oncology condition in the world. Well, you're only going to have, if you ever have regulatory approval, it's only going to be in the US, for instance. Okay, so then your market's getting smaller. Oh, it's only for this subset of patients. It's getting smaller. So the whole like, hey, this is a $100 billion market, and if we have 1% of this market, we'll all be billionaires. That doesn't work. So try to be a bit more sophisticated when it comes to addressing your market. So I leave the evaluation side to Jonathan, but thank you.